The great crystal halls of Nexus Prime had seen many first contact ceremonies over the past 3,000 years. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood in the center of the massive chamber, trying not to feel small under the towering ceiling that stretched up into darkness. Around her, representatives from 47 different species sat in carefully arranged sections, each designed to accommodate their unique physical needs. The crystalline hegemony members floated in shimmering energy fields. The aquatic delphinids rested in their water-filled observation pods. The insectoid hive speakers clicked and buzzed in their hive mind clusters. And dozens of other alien forms watched the human woman with varying degrees of curiosity and polite interest. Sarah had been chosen for this moment after months of preparation back on Earth. She was a career diplomat, fluent in 12 Earth languages, and had spent the last 6 months learning the basic trade tongue that most council species used for official business. Still, nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale and diversity of what humanity was trying to join. Supreme Chancellor Zixoth of the Ethereal Collective spoke first. His translucent form shifted colors as he communicated through both sound and light patterns. The translation device in Sarah's ear converted his words into English. We welcome the representatives of humanity to these sacred halls of peace. For 3 millennia, the Galactic Council has maintained harmony among the stars through the sacred principles of negotiation, compromise, and mutual understanding. We trust that humanity will embrace these same principles as you take your place among the civilized species of the galaxy. Sarah bowed respectfully. Thank you, Supreme Chancellor. Humanity is honored by this opportunity and eager to learn from the wisdom of the Council. The next several hours passed in formal introductions. Each major species had a representative who stood and spoke about their world, their culture, and their contributions to the galactic community. Sarah listened carefully, taking mental notes about each group. The Zephyrians were master traders who had turned commerce into an art form. The Tech Union had created most of the advanced technology that kept Council space functioning. The Symbiotic Collective had perfected biological sciences. Each species had found their niche, their way to contribute to the greater good. When Sarah's turn came, she stood and activated the holographic display that had been prepared back on Earth. Humanity comes from a world called Earth, in what you know as the Sol system. We are relatively new to space travel, having only developed faster-than-light capability in the last 50 years. Our world is diverse with many different cultures and nations that have learned to work together. We offer our skills in adaptability, problem-solving, and, she paused, choosing her words carefully, persistence in the face of challenges. The hologram showed images of Earth, blue oceans, green continents, sprawling cities, and humans engaged in various activities. The assembled aliens watched with polite interest. Many species had submitted similar presentations over the centuries. Councillor Veltar of the Crystalline Hegemony spoke next. Her crystalline form chimed like musical bells as she communicated. Your world appears pleasant, though we note the presence of multiple governmental structures. Most species achieve unity before reaching the stars. How do you maintain peace with such diversity? Sarah had expected this question. We've learned that diversity can be a strength when properly managed. Our different cultures and perspectives help us solve problems in ways that a single unified approach might miss. We've had our conflicts in the past, but we've developed systems to resolve them peacefully. This was mostly true, though Sarah didn't mention that humanity's systems often involved very non-peaceful enforcement mechanisms when peaceful resolution failed. After the formal presentations, Sarah was assigned to Kethvar, a senior Zephyrian diplomat who would serve as her guide during the integration process. Kethvar was tall and thin with blue-gray skin and large eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. Come, Kethvar said, his voice smooth and calming. Let me show you how the Council truly works. The formal ceremonies are necessary, but the real business happens in smaller gatherings. Over the next several days, Kethvar introduced Sarah to the intricate web of relationships that kept Council space functioning. Everything was about negotiation and compromise. When the agricultural worlds of the Rootkin Collective had a dispute with the mining operations of the Stone Shapers, they brought in mediators and worked out a trade agreement that satisfied both parties. When the exploring fleets of the Farseekers wanted to expand into territory claimed by the Void Dancers, The council arranged a complex deal involving shared exploration rights, technology exchanges, and cultural programs. You see, Kethavar explained as they walked through the diplomatic quarter, every conflict has a solution if you're willing to be creative. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it requires thinking in ways that neither side originally considered. But there is always a path to peace. Sarah nodded, but something about the confidence in his voice bothered her. What about when one side simply refuses to negotiate in good faith? What if they're not interested in compromise? Kethavar's large eyes blinked slowly. That rarely happens, Ambassador Chen. Most conflicts arise from misunderstanding or competing needs. When you address the underlying causes, the solutions become apparent. But what if someone is just evil? What if they want to hurt others for no good reason? The Zephyrian stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Evil? That's a very primitive concept, Ambassador. In a civilized galaxy, we understand that what appears to be malice is usually fear, desperation, or misguided self-interest. These can all be addressed through proper diplomatic channels. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course. I'm still learning your ways. During her third week on Nexus Prime, Sarah was invited to observe a council session dealing with what they called the Zerathi situation. She sat in the observer section, watching as dozens of species debated the issue. The Zerathi Empire had been expanding aggressively for the past century, taking territory from smaller species and displacing millions of beings. The council had been managing the situation through a series of agreements that gave the Zerathi access to uninhabited systems in exchange for leaving settled worlds alone. Senior Counselor Thexan of the Harmony Builders was presenting the latest proposal. The Zerathi have expressed frustration with the mineral content of the systems we previously allocated to them. They're requesting access to the Kepler sector, which is currently unclaimed but rich in heavy metals. Counselor Veltar chimed in response. The Kepler sector is adjacent to several of our member worlds. Granting the Zerathi access might make some of our allies nervous. Which is why, Thexan continued, I propose we offer them exclusive mining rights to half the sector, with the understanding that they maintain a buffer zone between their operations and our settled systems. The debate continued for hours, with various species suggesting modifications to the proposal. Nobody questioned whether the Zerathi should be given anything at all. The entire discussion was about finding the right combination of concessions to keep them satisfied. Sarah watched a holographic display showing Zerathi military movements. Their ships were massive, heavily armed, and seemed designed more for intimidation than exploration. She thought about humanity's own military vessels, smaller, faster, and built with different priorities in mind. After the session, she approached Kethavar with her questions. The Zerathi, she said carefully. They seem very militaristic. What exactly have they done that requires these negotiations? Kethavar's expression became somewhat uncomfortable. They've been aggressive in their expansion. Some of their methods have been unfortunate. Unfortunate how? They've displaced several smaller species from their homeworlds. The refugees have been relocated to council worlds, of course, and the Zerathi have agreed to compensation packages. Sarah felt that chill again. They kicked entire species off their home planets. The situations were complex. The Zerathi claimed those worlds had resources they needed for their civilization's survival. Rather than fight a war that would hurt everyone, the council negotiated relocations. It wasn't ideal, but it prevented bloodshed. That night, Sarah accessed the council's historical databases from her quarters. What she found made her stomach turn. The Zerathi hadn't just displaced the species they'd conquered. The reports, written in the careful diplomatic language of council bureaucrats, described what could only be called systematic torture and murder. The Alteran colonies had been depopulated through intensive resource extraction protocols. When Sarah dug deeper, she found testimony from refugees describing forced labor, medical experimentation, and mass killings. The Zerathi hadn't just taken the Alteran worlds. They'd used the population as test subjects for biological weapons. The hegemony of Whispers had been relocated after cultural compatibility issues with Zerathi expansion. The surviving Whisper speakers told stories of their libraries being burned, their historians executed, and their children taken for cultural integration programs that none had ever returned from. Sarah spent the rest of the night reading through similar reports. Each time, the Council had responded with negotiations. They offered the Zarathi new territories, trade agreements, technology exchanges, anything to stop the violence, and each time the Zarathi took what was offered and then demanded more. The next morning, Sarah requested a private meeting with Supreme Chancellor Zixoth. She was granted an audience in his personal chambers, a space filled with swirling energy patterns that somehow conveyed both ancient wisdom and infinite patience. "Supreme Chancellor," Sarah began, "I've been reviewing the history of the Zarathi situation and I have some concerns." The Chancellor's form shifted to deeper blue tones. "Ah, yes, the Zarathi. A challenging situation, but we've made significant progress over the years. They've been much more reasonable lately." "Reasonable? They've committed what my species would call genocide against at least 6 different peoples." The energy patterns around Zixoth fluctuated rapidly before settling into a cooler, more distant configuration. "Ambassador Chen, I understand that your species is still developing its understanding of complex diplomatic realities. What you call genocide, we recognize as the unfortunate result of cultural and resource conflicts. The important thing is that we've found ways to minimize future incidents while addressing the legitimate needs of all parties." Sarah stared at the swirling being in front of her. Legitimate needs? They murdered children. The Zarathi reproductive requirements and territorial instincts are different from most species. Their actions, while regrettable, stem from biological imperatives that they cannot simply ignore. Our role is not to judge, but to find solutions that work for everyone. And if they refuse to stop? If they keep killing? Ambassador Chen, that kind of thinking is exactly what has kept your species locked in primitive conflicts for so long. Here in civilized space, we understand that every being has value, even those whose actions we might personally disapprove of. The moment we start declaring certain groups as beyond redemption, we become no better than the very violence we seek to prevent. Sarah left the meeting feeling sick. That afternoon, she sent an encrypted message back to Earth, requesting permission to return for consultations. The response came back within hours. "Come home immediately." As she prepared to leave Nexus Prime, Kethvar visited her quarters one last time. "I hope you understand," he said, "that the Council's methods have kept the galaxy at peace for 3,000 years. Your species is young and still learning. Violence might seem like a quick solution, but it only creates more problems in the long run." Sarah looked at her Zephyrian guide, this being who had been nothing but kind and patient with her, and realized the vast gulf between their worldviews. "Kethvar," she said quietly, "what happens when someone refuses to be civilized? What do you do when negotiation fails?" "Negotiation never fails, Ambassador Chen. It only requires more creativity and patience." Sarah nodded politely, but in her heart, she knew that her species and the Council might never truly understand each other. As her ship prepared to depart Nexus Prime, she watched the great crystal spires of the Council buildings shrink into the distance. Back on Earth, there would be decisions to make. Humanity had been offered a chance to join the galactic community, but the price might be accepting a philosophy that went against everything humans had learned about dealing with evil. The stars stretched out before her ship, beautiful and infinite. Somewhere out there, the Zarathi were planning their next move, confident that the Council would continue to reward their violence with negotiations and concessions. Sarah Chen closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining the Council's approach to the survivors of humanity's own wars. She thought about how her grandfather, a veteran of Earth's last great conflict, would have reacted to being told that negotiation was always the answer. Some lessons, she reflected, were written in blood, and some of those lessons might be about to become very relevant again. After the session, she approached Kethvar with her questions. "The Zarathi," she said carefully, "they seem very militaristic. What exactly have they done that requires these negotiations?" Kethvar's expression became somewhat uncomfortable. "They've been aggressive in their expansion. Some of their methods have been unfortunate." "Unfortunate how?" "They've displaced several smaller species from their homeworlds. The refugees have been relocated to Council worlds, of course, and the Zarathi have agreed to compensation packages." Sarah felt that chill again. They kicked entire species off their home planets. The situations were complex. The Zarathi claimed those worlds had resources they needed for their civilization's survival. Rather than fight a war that would hurt everyone, the Council negotiated relocations. It wasn't ideal, but it prevented bloodshed. That night, Sarah accessed the Council's historical databases from her quarters. What she found made her stomach turn. The Zarathi hadn't just displaced the species they'd conquered. The reports, written in the careful diplomatic language of Council bureaucrats, described what could only be called systematic torture and murder. The Alteran colonies had been depopulated through intensive resource extraction protocols. When Sarah dug deeper, she found testimony from refugees describing forced labor, medical experimentation, and mass killings. The Zarathi hadn't just taken the Alteran worlds. They'd used the population as test subjects for biological weapons. The hegemony of Whispers had been relocated after cultural compatibility issues with Zarathi expansion. The surviving Whisper speakers told stories of their libraries being burned, their historians executed, and their children taken for cultural integration programs that none had ever returned from. Sarah spent the rest of the night reading through similar reports. Each time, the Council had responded with negotiations. They offered the Zarathi new territories, trade agreements, technology exchanges, anything to stop the violence, and each time the Zarathi took what was offered and then demanded more. The next morning, Sarah requested a private meeting with Supreme Chancellor Zixoth. She was granted an audience in his personal chambers, a space filled with swirling energy patterns that somehow conveyed both ancient wisdom and infinite patience. "Supreme Chancellor," Sarah began, "I've been reviewing the history of the Zarathi situation, and I have some concerns." The Chancellor's form shifted to deeper blue tones. "Ah, yes, the Zarathi. A challenging situation, but we've made significant progress over the years. They've been much more reasonable lately." "Reasonable? They've committed what my species would call genocide against at least 6 different peoples." The energy patterns around Zixoth fluctuated rapidly before settling into a cooler, more distant configuration. "Ambassador Chen, I understand that your species is still developing its understanding of complex diplomatic realities. What you call genocide, we recognize as the unfortunate result of cultural and resource conflicts. The important thing is that we've found ways to minimize future incidents while addressing the legitimate needs of all parties." Sarah stared at the swirling being in front of her. Legitimate needs? They murdered children. The Zarathi reproductive requirements and territorial instincts are different from most species. Their actions, while regrettable, stem from biological imperatives that they cannot simply ignore. Our role is not to judge, but to find solutions that work for everyone. And if they refuse to stop? If they keep killing? Ambassador Chen, that kind of thinking is exactly what has kept your species locked in primitive conflicts for so long. Here in civilized space, we understand that every being has value, even those whose actions we might personally disapprove of. The moment we start declaring certain groups as beyond redemption, we become no better than the very violence we seek to prevent. Sarah left the meeting feeling sick. That afternoon, she sent an encrypted message back to Earth, requesting permission to return for consultations. The response came back within hours. "Come home immediately." As she prepared to leave Nexus Prime, Kethvar visited her quarters one last time. "I hope you understand," he said, "that the Council's methods have kept the galaxy at peace for 3,000 years. Your species is young and still learning. Violence might seem like a quick solution, but it only creates more problems in the long run." Sarah looked at her Zephyrian guide, this being who had been nothing but kind and patient with her, and realized the vast gulf between their worldviews. "Kethvar," she said quietly, "what happens when someone refuses to be civilized? What do you do when negotiation fails?" "Negotiation never fails, Ambassador Chen. It only requires more creativity and patience." Sarah nodded politely, but in her heart, she knew that her species and the Council might never truly understand each other. As her ship prepared to depart Nexus Prime, she watched the great crystal spires of the Council buildings shrink into the distance. Back on Earth, there would be decisions to make. Humanity had been offered a chance to join the galactic community, but the price might be accepting a philosophy that went against everything humans had learned about dealing with evil. The stars stretched out before her ship, beautiful and infinite. Somewhere out there, the Zarathi were planning their next move, confident that the Council would continue to reward their violence with negotiations and concessions. Sarah Chen closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining the Council's approach to the survivors of humanity's own wars. She thought about how her grandfather, a veteran of Earth's last great conflict, would have reacted to being told that negotiation was always the answer. Some lessons, she reflected, were written in blood, and some of those lessons might be about to become very relevant again. 3 months after Ambassador Sarah Chen's return to Earth, the emergency sessions on Nexus Prime had been running for 6 straight days. The great crystal halls, normally filled with the measured tones of diplomatic discussion, now buzzed with urgent conversations and hastily arranged meetings. The crisis had begun in the outer rim of council space, in the peaceful Alteran border colonies that had been rebuilt after the refugees' relocation decades earlier. The new generation of Alterans had grown up on these worlds, believing themselves safe under council protection. They were artists and philosophers, their crystalline cities centers of learning and culture that attracted visitors from across the galaxy. The attack had come without warning. Zarathi battle fleets, larger and more aggressive than anything seen before, had swept through the Alteran systems like a plague. But this time they hadn't simply conquered and displaced. This time, they had started killing. Councillor Veltar of the crystalline hegemony stood at the center of the emergency session, her normally harmonious chimes now discordant with distress. The reports from the survivors are difficult to process. The Zarathi appear to have abandoned their previous patterns of territorial expansion in favor of what can only be described as systematic extermination. The holographic displays around the chamber showed the devastating evidence. Alteran cities reduced to glass and ash, refugee ships destroyed as they tried to flee, and most horrifying of all, the transmission logs that Zarathi commanders had broadcast during the attacks, describing their actions as biological research and species improvement studies. Supreme Chancellor Zixoth's energy patterns had been cycling through deep reds and purples for hours, indicating extreme distress. We must understand what has driven the Zarathi to this unprecedented level of aggression. There must be underlying factors that we haven't properly addressed. Senior Counselor Thexan of the Harmony Builders had been working frantically with his staff to develop response options. I've been in contact with Zarathi diplomatic channels. They claim the Alterans were harboring biological weapons and posed an existential threat to Zarathi security. They're willing to discuss the situation if we can provide them with suitable assurances about future threats. A collective gasp went through the chamber. Counselor Murthak of the Symbiotic Collective spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Biological weapons? The Alterans are pacifists. They've never developed anything more dangerous than advanced art supplies. Nevertheless, Thexan continued, the Zarathi position is that they acted in self-defense. They're prepared to cease hostilities if the Council can guarantee their security through additional territorial concessions and technology transfers. The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's long history. Species that had never raised their voices in 3 millennia of cooperation now argued with passion and desperation. The Delphinids, whose own worlds bordered Zarathi space, demanded immediate military intervention. The Tech Union called for economic sanctions. The Void Dancers suggested mass evacuation of all border worlds. But through it all, the fundamental assumption remained unchanged. The solution lay in negotiation. Kethvar, Sarah Chen's former guide, stood to address the assembly. His usual calm demeanor was strained, but his voice remained steady. The Council has faced challenges before. The Zarathi expansion 30 years ago, the resource wars of the previous century, the territorial disputes before that. In every case, patient diplomacy has found a path to peace. We must not abandon our principles now, in our moment of greatest test. And what exactly are you proposing? Demanded Counselor Murthak. The Zarathi have murdered millions of innocents. They're broadcasting recordings of their experiments for the galaxy to see. How do we negotiate with that? Kethavar's large eyes reflected the chamber's lights as he considered his response. We find out what they really want. No species commits violence without reason. The Zarathi are clearly desperate about something. Our job is to discover what that something is and address it. The Chancellor's energy patterns shifted to a more organized configuration as he took control of the session. Counselor Kethavar speaks wisely. I'm authorizing a special diplomatic mission to the Zarathi homeworld. We'll offer them immediate concessions to stop the killing while we work to understand their underlying concerns. The proposal that emerged over the next 18 hours was staggering in its scope. The Council offered the Zarathi exclusive control over 3 entire star systems, including 2 that contained established mining operations. They proposed technology transfers that would give the Zerathi access to council medical and agricultural advances. They even suggested creating a joint research commission to address whatever security concerns had motivated the attacks. When the offer was transmitted to the Zerathi, the response came back within 6 hours. War Prime Skraxhal, the Zerathi's supreme military commander, appeared on the communication channels with what could only be described as amusement. "The Council's generosity is noted," Skraxhal said, his scarred face splitting into what passed for a smile among his species. "We accept these terms as a down payment on future negotiations." Relief flooded through the council chambers. Several representatives began congratulating each other on avoiding a wider conflict, but Skraxhal wasn't finished. "However, our research on Alteran physiology has revealed new security concerns. We've discovered that several other species in council space share similar biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. We require additional territories and populations for protective studies." The transmission cut off, leaving the council in stunned silence. Within hours, reports began coming in of Zerathi fleets moving toward the Delphinid aquatic worlds. The species that had helped design the peaceful first contact protocols for dozens of civilizations now faced the same fate as the Alterans. In her private chambers, Sarah Chen received the emergency briefing from Earth's intelligence networks. She had been on Nexus Prime as an unofficial observer, watching the Council's response unfold with growing horror. The images in the classified files were worse than anything the Council had shared publicly. The Zerathi weren't just killing their victims, they were studying them, breaking them down piece by piece to understand how different species experienced pain, fear, and death. The biological research they claimed to be conducting was torture refined into a science. Sarah requested an immediate private audience with Supreme Chancellor Zixoth. She found him in his meditation chambers, surrounded by swirling patterns of light that seemed to reflect his inner turmoil. "Chancellor," she began carefully, "I've been authorized by my government to offer Earth's assistance in dealing with the Zerathi situation." The energy patterns around Zixoth shifted to curious blues and greens. "What kind of assistance does humanity propose, Ambassador Chen?" "Military assistance. Our fleet is small compared to what we've seen of Council forces, but we've had extensive experience dealing with aggressive expansionist powers. We're prepared to help stop the Zerathi attacks." The Chancellor's form flickered with what seemed like alarm. "Military assistance? Ambassador, surely you understand that violence only breeds more violence. The moment we resort to military force, we become no better than the Zerathi themselves." Sarah felt the familiar frustration that had driven her from Nexus Prime months earlier. "With respect, Chancellor, the Zerathi are committing genocide. They're torturing entire populations for their own amusement. How is stopping them morally equivalent to what they're doing?" Sarah felt the familiar frustration that had driven her from Nexus Prime months earlier. "With respect, Chancellor, the Zerathi are committing genocide. They're torturing entire populations for their own amusement. How is stopping them morally equivalent to what they're doing? Because the moment we decide that some beings are beyond redemption, we start down a path that leads to the very darkness we seek to avoid. The Zerathi may be misguided, but they are still sentient beings with their own fears and needs. Our role is to help them find better ways to address those needs. And if they refuse, if they keep killing while you're trying to help them find better ways?" Zixoth's patterns settled into the deep, patient colors that Sarah had learned indicated absolute conviction. "Then we must try harder. We must be more creative, more generous, more understanding. The alternative is to abandon everything that separates civilization from barbarism." Sarah left the meeting knowing that the conversation had been pointless. The Council would continue to offer concessions while the Zerathi continued to kill. She began composing her report to Earth, knowing what the response would be. 2 days later, as Zerathi forces began their assault on the Delphinid homeworld, the Council convened another emergency session. This time they offered 5-star systems, exclusive access to rare mineral deposits, and a formal declaration that the Zerathi Empire would be recognized as a major partner in Council governance. The Zerathi accepted the offer and immediately used their new territories as staging areas for attacks on the insectoid hive speakers. Councillor Murthak had had enough. Standing before the assembly, his bioluminescent patches flashing with anger, he delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. "How many species must die while we congratulate ourselves on our moral superiority? The Zerathi aren't misunderstood or desperate. They're predators who've learned that we'll pay them to kill. Every concession we offer is blood money that enables the next atrocity. The chamber erupted in arguments. Half the council supported Murthak's position, while the other half accused him of abandoning the principles that had kept the galaxy peaceful for millennia. Through it all, Kethvar stood quietly, his large eyes reflecting the chaos around him. When the shouting finally died down, he spoke in the same calm voice he'd used to welcome Sarah Chen all those months ago. I understand the frustration. I truly do. But we must remember that the moment we choose violence over negotiation, we become the very thing we claim to oppose. The Zarathi may be committing terrible acts, but they're still fellow sentients sharing this galaxy with us. If we abandon our commitment to peaceful resolution, what separates us from them? Councillor Veltar chimed in agreement. The Zephyrian speaks truth. Yes, the Zarathi actions are regrettable, but if we respond with violence, how do we explain that to the next generation? How do we tell them that peace is possible while showing them that we turned to war when things became difficult? The session ended without resolution, but Sarah Chen had heard enough. That evening, she sent a coded transmission to Earth. Council unwilling to take meaningful action. Zarathi growing bolder. Recommend immediate deployment. The response came back 12 hours later. Fleet already en route. Maintain cover until arrival. As Sarah prepared for what was coming, she watched the Delphinid refugee ship streaming past Nexus Prime. Thousands of aquatic beings who had done nothing wrong except live in the path of Zarathi expansion. The Council had already begun preparing new negotiations, offering the Zarathi even more concessions in exchange for restraint in their research programs. In her private quarters, Sarah composed her final report as an observer. She wrote about the Council's genuine commitment to peace, their horror at violence, and their absolute inability to recognize that some threats couldn't be negotiated away. She wrote about species that had evolved on peaceful worlds, who had never faced existential threats and couldn't comprehend evil that killed for its own sake. She wrote about the tragic irony of a civilization so committed to preserving life that they couldn't bring themselves to stop those who destroyed it. But mostly she wrote about the refugees, the survivors of species who had trusted in Council protection and paid for that trust with everything they held dear. As she finished the report, Sarah looked out at the stars surrounding Nexus Prime. Somewhere out there, human ships were approaching at maximum speed. Soon the galaxy would learn what happened when humanity encountered evil that refused to be reasoned with. The Council had spent 3,000 years proving that negotiation could solve any problem. Humanity was about to prove them wrong. The emergency session of the United Earth Assembly had been called at 300 hours Geneva time, but every representative was present. President Maria Santos stood at the podium, her face grim as she looked out at the assembled delegates from every nation, colony, and orbital habitat that humanity called home. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. 3 hours ago, we received Ambassador Chen's final intelligence report from Nexus Prime. The situation in Council space has deteriorated beyond anything we initially understood. The massive screens around the chamber lit up with images that made even hardened military veterans look away. Recordings from Zarathi broadcasts showing their research facilities. Bodies of Alteran children arranged in rows for experimental purposes. Delphinid families being separated for what the Zarathi called stress response studies. The Galactic Council, President Santos continued, has responded to this genocide by offering the perpetrators more territory and resources. Their latest proposal would give the Zarathi Empire control over systems containing 12 billion innocent beings. A murmur of disgust swept through the assembly. General Patricia Okafor, the head of Earth's military command, stood from her seat. Madam President, what exactly are we being asked to consider? Santos looked directly at the general. The question before us is simple. Do we stand by and watch while the Council negotiates with mass murderers? Or do we act according to the principles that have guided humanity through our darkest hours? The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Assembly's history, but not because it was long or contentious. Instead, it was remarkable for its brevity and unanimity. Representative after representative stood to speak, and every speech said essentially the same thing. Dr. James Harrison from the Luna colony spoke first. My grandparents lived through the European genocide programs of the 20th century. They taught me that evil ignored is evil enabled. We cannot stand by while history repeats itself among the stars. Admiral Chen Wei of the Mars Defense Force was next. The Zarathi have made their intentions clear. They're not expanding for resources or territory. They're killing because they enjoy it. This is exactly the kind of threat our fleets were built to stop. Representative after representative echoed the same theme. From the orbital habitats to the outer colonies, from the oldest Earth nations to the newest stellar settlements, the message was clear. Humanity would not negotiate with genocidal maniacs. The final vote was 347 in favor of military intervention, with 0 votes against and 3 abstentions from representatives who couldn't reach their home governments in time. President Santos signed the authorization immediately. Operation Righteous Fury is hereby approved. Our fleets will deploy to Council space with the mission of stopping Zarathi aggression through whatever means necessary. As the assembly session ended, Admiral Torres was already in his command bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps. Coordinating with fleet commanders across the solar system, the response had been planned for months ever since Ambassador Chen's initial reports about the Zarathi situation. Status report, Torres called out as he entered the command center. Captain Lisa Park, his chief of staff, looked up from her displays. All fleet elements report ready for immediate deployment. The Indomitable and her task force are already moving toward the edge of the system. Total force strength, 212 ships including 18 heavy dreadnoughts. Torres nodded grimly. Rules of engagement? As authorized by the Assembly, sir. Any Zarathi forces engaged in aggressive action against civilian populations are to be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. We're not going there to negotiate. The news of humanity's decision reached Nexus Prime within hours. Ambassador Chen was summoned to an emergency meeting with Supreme Chancellor Zixoth and the senior council leadership. She found them in a state of barely controlled panic. Ambassador Chen, the Chancellor began, his energy pattern cycling rapidly through reds and oranges. We've received disturbing reports that your government is mobilizing military forces for deployment to Council space. Surely this is some kind of misunderstanding. Sarah looked around the chamber at the assembled alien leaders, beings who had spent their entire lives believing that any problem could be solved through proper negotiation and compromise. They simply couldn't comprehend a species that would choose military action over diplomatic solutions. There's no misunderstanding, Chancellor. Earth has decided that the Zarathi threat requires immediate military intervention. We will not stand by while genocide continues. Kethvar stepped forward, his usual calm completely shattered. Ambassador, you must understand the catastrophic implications of what you're proposing. Military action will destabilize the entire galaxy. Once violence becomes an acceptable solution, where does it end? It ends, Sarah replied quietly, when the people committing genocide are stopped. Councillor Veltar's crystalline form chimed with distress. But we're making progress with the Zarathi. Just yesterday, they agreed to limit their research activities to volunteer subjects. With time and patience, we can convince them to abandon their more extreme practices. Sarah stared at the crystalline being in disbelief. Volunteer subjects? They're torturing children and calling them volunteers? The terminology is admittedly problematic, interjected Senior Counselor Thexan, but it represents a step toward more ethical practices. Change takes time, Ambassador. We cannot expect the Zarathi to abandon their entire worldview overnight. The meeting continued for 3 hours, with council leaders offering increasingly desperate alternatives to military action. They proposed creating a joint commission to monitor Zarathi research. They suggested offering humanity direct territorial compensation in exchange for standing down. They even offered to make Earth a permanent member of the Council's Security Committee. Every offer was politely but firmly refused. The decision has been made, Sarah finally told them. Earth's fleet is already en route. I strongly suggest that Council forces avoid interfering with our mission. Supreme Chancellor Zixoth's energy pattern stabilized into the deep, patient blues that indicated his final decision-making mode. Ambassador Chen, I'm afraid we cannot allow this. The Council has a responsibility to maintain peace throughout our space. If human forces attempt to engage in military action within Council territory, we will be forced to intervene. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but her voice remained steady. Chancellor, are you threatening to fire on human ships to protect the Zarathi? We are promising to protect the principles of peaceful resolution that have kept this galaxy stable for 3 millennia. If that requires stopping human military action, then yes, we will do what we must. The conversation ended with both sides retreating to prepare for what was coming. As Sarah left the chamber, she sent a coded message to Admiral Torres. Council may attempt to interfere. Recommend maximum caution on approach. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zarathi Empire's core territory, like a steel fist emerging from the void. Admiral Torres stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching as his tactical displays painted targets throughout the system ahead. Zarathi space was a monument to military might. Massive fortress stations orbited every inhabited world, their weapon arrays designed to intimidate as much as defend. The Zarathi ships themselves were enormous, bristling with armor and weapons that spoke of a culture that had turned warfare into an art form. What the humans saw on their sensors, however, told a different story than mere military strength. The energy signatures revealed space stations that were as much research facilities as defensive positions. The massive ships carried not just weapons, but laboratories. Even the planetside installations showed the unmistakable patterns of large-scale containment facilities. This wasn't just a military empire. It was an industrial-scale torture operation that spanned multiple solar systems. Admiral, his communications officer announced, "We're receiving a transmission from the primary Zarathi command station. Put it through." The holographic display flickered to life, showing War Prime Skraxhall in his command chamber. The Zarathi leader was an imposing figure, standing nearly 3 meters tall with scarred gray skin, and the kind of predatory features that evolution produced in apex hunters. Behind him, the humans could see displays showing what were obviously monitoring feeds from prison facilities. "So," Skraxhall said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a battle, "the Council has finally found the courage to send something more threatening than negotiators. Though I must admit, I expected something more impressive than this small fleet of primitives." Admiral Torres looked at the alien warlord with the same expression he might use for an interesting species of venomous insect. "War Prime Skraxhall, I am Admiral Marcus Torres of the United Earth Fleet. You are guilty of genocide against multiple sentient species. You will surrender immediately and submit to justice." Skraxhall's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Justice? From creatures who have barely learned to leave their home system? Human, do you have any idea what you're facing? The Zarathi Empire spans 47 star systems. Our fleets have conquered species that had been spacefaring for millennia, before your ancestors discovered fire. What makes you think your tiny collection of ships poses any threat to us?" Torres's response was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone he had used during the liberation of the Martian colonies 30 years earlier. "You have 10 minutes to surrender unconditionally and release all prisoners. This is not a negotiation. This is a warning." The Zarathi War Prime's expression shifted from amusement to genuine confusion. "A warning? Human, I have 200 ships in this system alone. Each one is larger and more heavily armed than your entire fleet. Are you suffering from some form of mental breakdown?" 8 minutes. Skraxhall leaned forward, his predatory features twisting into what might have been curiosity. "Very well. I admit your species intrigues me. The Council has been sending us diplomatic messages for months, offering us ever greater concessions for our research programs. Now they send a handful of ships with demands. This should be educational." He gestured to someone off-screen and the display split to show multiple viewpoints from within Zarathi facilities. Humans could see Alterran survivors huddled in cells, Delphinid families separated and confined in what were obviously medical research areas. Even some species that Torres didn't recognize, all clearly being held against their will. "Perhaps," Skraxhall continued, "we should discuss terms. I'm willing to negotiate the release of some prisoners in exchange for your fleet's withdrawal. Let us say 1,000 prisoners for your immediate departure from Zarathi space." 5 minutes. The War Prime's confusion was giving way to anger. "Human, you are clearly not understanding the situation. I am offering you a way to save lives and preserve your ships. Your primitive understanding of warfare may not have prepared you for the reality of modern space combat." Torres looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. Lieutenant Sarah Kim was monitoring the sensor readings of Zarathi prison facilities. Commander James Rodriguez was coordinating with the fleet's marine units. Captain Lisa Park was overseeing the targeting solutions for what was coming next. Every one of them had the same expression. Cold, focused determination. "War Prime," Torres said quietly. I want to make sure you understand something. We didn't come here to negotiate. We didn't come here to trade. We came here to stop you, period. 2 minutes. Scraxhall's predatory calm finally cracked. You arrogant little primitive. Do you think your handful of ships can challenge an empire that has dominated this region of space for centuries? I'll show you what happens to insects that buzz too loudly around their betters. The communication cut off, and immediately the Zarathi fleet began moving into attack formation. Their ships were massive, designed to overwhelm opponents through sheer firepower and intimidation. Warprime Scraxhall had never faced an enemy that didn't surrender after seeing the full might of Zarathi military power. Admiral, Lieutenant Kim called out from her sensor station. Zarathi fleet is moving to engage. 237 ships, including 12 super dreadnoughts. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, demanding our surrender. Torres checked his chronometer. Time's up. All ships commence Operation Righteous Fury. Primary targets are prison facilities and command stations. Secondary targets are any vessel showing aggressive intent toward civilian populations. The human fleet moved with precision that spoke of decades of training and experience. Unlike the massive Zarathi vessels that relied on overwhelming firepower, human ships had been designed around speed, maneuverability, and concentrated application of force. The first Zarathi ships to engage learned too late that size wasn't everything in space combat. The human destroyer Retribution, one of Torres's smaller vessels, engaged a Zarathi heavy cruiser that outmassed it by a factor of 10. Instead of trading broadsides like traditional space combat doctrine suggested, the Retribution used its superior acceleration to stay in the larger ship's blind spots while systematically targeting critical systems. Within 12 minutes, the Zarathi cruiser was drifting powerless, its crew trapped in a ship that had become a tomb. Across the battle zone, the same pattern repeated itself. Human ships used tactics that the galaxy had never seen before. They coordinated their attacks with surgical precision, targeting weaknesses that their intensive intelligence gathering had revealed. They used weapon systems designed not for intimidation, but for maximum effect. The Zarathi had built their military around the assumption that bigger was better. Humans had built theirs around the assumption that winning was everything. Warprime Scraxhall watched in growing horror as his fleet was systematically dismantled. The humans weren't just defeating his ships. They were doing it with an efficiency that bordered on the mathematical. Every attack was calculated, every movement precise, every target carefully chosen for maximum strategic effect. How are they doing this? He demanded of his tactical officers. Their ships are tiny. Their fleet is outnumbered 4-1. Sir? His chief weapons officer replied, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. They're not fighting like anyone we've ever faced. They're not trying to disable our ships. They're trying to destroy them. Completely. They're using nuclear weapons as area denial weapons. They're coordinating focused fire that overwhelms our shields in seconds. And they're targeting. They know exactly where to hit us to cause maximum damage. On the Indomitable's bridge, Admiral Torres watched as his fleet carved through the Zarathi formation like a blade through soft tissue. The enemy ships were impressive looking, but they had been designed by a species that had gotten used to winning through intimidation rather than actual combat capability. Admiral, Commander Rodriguez called out. Marine boarding teams report successful infiltration of Prison Station Alpha. They've secured approximately 2,000 prisoners and are beginning evacuation procedures. Any resistance? Minimal, sir. The station security forces surrendered as soon as they realized they were facing human Marines. Torres nodded. Human Marines had a reputation even within Earth's military. They were volunteers who had specifically trained for exactly this kind of mission, rescuing prisoners from hostile forces. Every one of them had grown up hearing stories about humanity's liberation campaigns during the colonial wars. The battle continued for 6 hours, but the outcome had been clear after the first 30 minutes. The Zarathi fleet fought with desperate courage, but they were facing an enemy that had been designed from the ground up to fight and win against superior numbers. When Warprime Scraxhall's flagship finally lost power and began broadcasting surrender signals, the human fleet held position around the remaining Zarathi vessels. Of the original 237 ships, 43 were still capable of movement. The rest were either destroyed or disabled. Torres opened a communication channel to the Zarathi command ship. Warprime Scraxhall, this is Admiral Torres. Do you surrender? The holographic display showed the Zarathi leader sitting in what was obviously a damaged command center. His predatory confidence had been replaced by something that looked like genuine bewilderment. "How?" he asked simply. "How did you defeat us so completely?" Torres looked at the alien warlord who had been responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent beings. "Because we've had to learn how to fight against impossible odds. Your species conquered others who had never faced real war. Our species grew up fighting each other. We learned that if you're going to fight, you fight to win, completely and without reservation. What happens now? Now you surrender your remaining forces, release all prisoners, and submit to justice for your crimes against sentient life." Scraxhell was quiet for a long moment. "And if I refuse?" Torres's expression didn't change. "Then we finish what we started." The formal surrender came 3 hours later. Zarathi forces throughout their empire received orders to stand down and cooperate with human liberation forces. Prison facilities that had operated for decades were opened. Millions of prisoners from dozens of species were freed and evacuated to safety. As Torres stood on his bridge watching the evacuation ships departing for council space, his communications officer received a priority transmission from Nexus Prime. "Sir, it's from the Galactic Council. They're requesting immediate negotiations regarding the situation." Torres almost smiled. "Tell them we'll be happy to discuss the humanitarian aid requirements for the liberated populations. As for everything else, tell them there's nothing to negotiate." Across the galaxy, species that had spent millennia believing that negotiation was always the answer watched recordings of the battle and struggled to understand what they had witnessed. In 6 hours, a small human fleet had accomplished what the entire Galactic Council had been unable to achieve in decades of diplomatic effort. They had stopped the Zarathi. Completely. The age of assuming that evil could be negotiated with was over. The great crystal halls of Nexus Prime had never seen anything like the emergency session that convened 3 days after the Battle of Zarathi Prime. Representatives from all 47 council species packed into chambers that suddenly seemed too small for the magnitude of what they were trying to process. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood once again in the center of the assembly, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her sat Admiral Torres, still wearing his fleet uniform, and beside him were 3 beings that had changed everything. Kythera, an Alteran artist who had survived 18 months in Zarathi research facilities. Mirdek, a Delphinid engineer whose entire family had been killed in the laboratories. And Zixtal, a young hive speaker whose species had been declared extinct until human marines found survivors in the deepest levels of Zarathi prison stations. Supreme Chancellor, Zixoth's energy patterns had been cycling through confused colors for hours. The being who had spent centuries believing that every problem had a diplomatic solution was struggling to understand what the humans had accomplished. Ambassador Chen, the Chancellor began, his voice carrying overtones of bewilderment. "The Council has reviewed the reports from Zarathi space. The scale of what your military forces achieved in a single day is unprecedented in galactic history." Sarah nodded respectfully. "The human fleet accomplished exactly what it set out to do, Chancellor. The Zarathi genocide has been stopped, their military capability has been neutralized, and their prisoners have been liberated." Councillor Veltar's crystalline form chimed with distress. But at what cost? The destruction was enormous. Entire Zarathi fleet formations were eliminated. Their industrial capacity has been crippled. How do we explain this level of violence to future generations? Admiral Torres spoke for the first time since the session began. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much war, but knew why it had been necessary. "Counselor, with respect, the Zarathi had 47 star systems. They controlled hundreds of industrial stations. They had research facilities on dozens of worlds. In our entire operation, we targeted only military vessels that fired on us, and facilities that were being used to imprison and torture innocent beings. We could have done much worse." Senior Counselor Thexan leaned forward, his bioluminescent patches flashing with agitation. "But surely there must have been alternatives. Some way to achieve the same result without resorting to such extreme measures." Kythera, the Alteran survivor, spoke up from her place beside Admiral Torres. Her voice was soft but carried clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "Counselor, I spent 547 days in Zarathi facilities. I watched them torture children to study fear responses. I saw them separate families to test grief reactions. I witnessed experiments that I cannot describe in civilized company. While you were negotiating with my captors, offering them rewards for moderation, they were using my people as laboratory animals. The chamber fell silent. Mirdek, the Delphinid engineer, continued where Kithara had left off. The Zarathi weren't interested in your negotiations except as ways to gain time and resources for expanded operations. Every concession you offered them, they used to build more prison facilities. Every system you gave them access to, they filled with new victims. Zeekstal, the young hive speaker, added his perspective through the electronic interface that translated his species' complex biochemical communications. The Zarathi told us that the council approved of their research. They said the negotiations proved that our suffering was acceptable to the civilized galaxy, as long as it happened quietly. They used your diplomatic contacts as proof that no one would come to help us. The impact of these testimonies on the council was visible. Species that had spent millennia believing in the moral superiority of peaceful resolution were confronted with the voices of those their policies had failed to protect. Kethvar, Sarah's former guide, stood to address the assembly. His usual calm was strained, but his commitment to council principles remained unshaken. The suffering described is indeed horrific, and we all share the grief of the survivors. But surely we must consider the broader implications of what has occurred. Humanity has introduced military force as an acceptable solution to galactic disputes. Where does this lead? If every species decides that violence is preferable to negotiation, how do we maintain the peace that has existed for 3,000 years? Admiral Torres met the Zephyrian's gaze directly. Counselor Kethvar, you speak of maintaining peace, but there was no peace in Zarathi space. There was only suffering that you chose not to see. The question isn't whether military force is acceptable. It's whether allowing genocide to continue is acceptable. But once we accept violence as a solution, Kethvar persisted, how do we control it? What prevents the next crisis from escalating into galaxy-wide warfare? Sarah Chen stepped forward, understanding that this was the moment that would define humanity's relationship with the galactic community. Counselor, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how to prevent all violence. It's how to prevent evil from taking advantage of good intentions. The Zarathi didn't commit genocide because diplomacy failed. They committed genocide because they knew diplomacy would protect them from consequences. She gestured toward the survivors beside her. These beings and millions like them paid the price for the Council's unwillingness to recognize that some threats cannot be negotiated away. Our species learned this lesson during our own dark periods. Evil that is appeased is evil that is enabled. Supreme Chancellor Zixoth's energy pattern shifted to the deep contemplative colors that indicated serious consideration. What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador Chen? 2 paths forward, Chancellor. The Council can continue as it has, maintaining its commitment to negotiation-only solutions, or it can recognize that civilization sometimes needs to be defended with more than good intentions. The debate that followed lasted for 18 hours and split the Council in ways that would reshape galactic politics for generations. Progressive species like the Tech Union and the Symbiotic Collective argued for military cooperation with humanity. Traditional diplomatists insisted that violence would only breed more. Violence. Counselor Murthak of the Symbiotic Collective delivered what many considered the most important speech in Council history. We have spent 3 millennia congratulating ourselves on our moral superiority while the Zarathi turned torture into an industrial process. We have offered rewards to mass murderers while their victims screamed for help that never came. If this is what civilization looks like, then perhaps we need to reconsider what civilization means. The final vote was closer than anyone expected. 24 species voted to establish military cooperation protocols with humanity. 21 voted to maintain traditional diplomatic approaches, and 2 abstained pending consultation with their home governments. The galaxy had split. 3 months later, the Terra Accords were signed in a ceremony aboard the human ship Indomitable, now orbiting the former Zarathi homeworld. Representatives from 26 species committed their governments to a mutual defense pact based on the principle that some threats required military response. The founding document was simple and direct. We, the undersigned species, recognize that while diplomacy and negotiation remain the preferred methods for resolving disputes, there exist threats that cannot be reasoned with, bargained with, or appeased. When faced with genocide, slavery, or other crimes against sentient life, we commit to collective action to protect the innocent, regardless of the political inconvenience such action might create. The remaining council species established what they called the Traditional Diplomatic Union, maintaining their commitment to negotiation-only solutions. They relocated their capital to a system far from human space and began the process of rebuilding their civilization around even stricter pacifist principles. Sarah Chen was appointed as the first Ambassador General of the Terra Alliance, responsible for coordinating between human forces and their new allies. Her first official act was to establish the Galactic Rescue Service, a joint military humanitarian organization designed to respond to future situations like the Zarathi crisis. Admiral Torres remained in command of human fleet operations, but now worked with officers from dozens of species who had learned from human military doctrine. The galaxy watched nervously as this new alliance began conducting joint training exercises and sharing tactical knowledge. The true test of the new system came 18 months later, when a species called the Harvester Collective began enslaving primitive civilizations in the Outer Rim. The Traditional Diplomatic Union sent negotiators and offered the Harvesters uninhabited systems in exchange for ceasing their operations. The Terra Alliance sent a joint fleet that liberated the enslaved populations in a week-long campaign that became known as the Outer Rim Liberation. Standing on the bridge of the Indomitable as the last Harvester prison ship surrendered, Admiral Torres found himself thinking about the conversation that had started humanity's involvement in galactic affairs. Kethavar had asked what prevented the next crisis from escalating into galaxy-wide warfare. The answer, Torres had learned, wasn't preventing all conflict. It was making sure that when conflict came, it was the right people who won. As refugee ships carrying liberated slaves departed for safety, Torres received a communication from an unexpected source. Kethavar, still serving with the Traditional Diplomatic Union, appeared on the holographic display looking older and more tired than Torres remembered. "Admiral Torres," the Zephyrian said quietly, "I wanted to congratulate you on another successful operation." Torres was surprised by the contact. "Thank you, Counselor. I thought the Traditional Union disapproved of our methods." "We do, but I have come to understand that disapproval and gratitude are not mutually exclusive." Kethavar paused, his large eyes reflecting lights from his ship's control panels. "The beings you rescued today will live free lives because of what you did. I cannot argue with such results even if I cannot embrace your methods. What about the principles of peaceful resolution? The commitment to negotiation?" Kethavar was quiet for a long moment. "Perhaps there is room in a civilized galaxy for more than one approach to civilization. You have shown that sometimes the innocent need protectors who are willing to do what we cannot." The communication ended, leaving Torres alone with his thoughts. Outside the ship's windows, the stars of the Outer Rim stretched into infinity. Somewhere among those stars were species that had never heard of humanity or the Terra Alliance. Some of them might be facing threats that negotiation couldn't solve. When that happened, Torres knew there would be ships ready to help. Ships crewed by beings who understood that some things were worth fighting for, and that evil ignored was evil enabled. In her quarters aboard the Alliance flagship, Sarah Chen was writing her final report as Earth's ambassador to the galactic community. She wrote about a civilization that had found two different answers to the question of how to respond to evil. Some species had chosen to maintain their faith in negotiation and compromise, believing that given enough time and patience, any problem could be solved peacefully. They had built a society based on the hope that all sentient beings were fundamentally reasonable. Other species had chosen to accept that some problems required force to solve, that some threats could not be negotiated away, and that sometimes civilization needed to be defended by those willing to fight for it. Both approaches would continue to exist in the galaxy, sometimes working together, sometimes operating independently, but always defined by their fundamental disagreement about the nature of evil and how to respond to it. As Sarah finished her report, she looked out at the stars and wondered what humanity's children would make of the galaxy they had helped to reshape. The age of universal negotiation was over, but the age of universal freedom was just beginning. In the deepest archives of the Terra Alliance, the testimonies of genocide survivors were preserved alongside the tactical reports of liberation campaigns. Future generations would read these records and understand why their ancestors had chosen to fight, rather than negotiate with murderers. The galaxy had learned, finally and definitively, that humans don't bargain with evil. And the Council truly had no words for what that meant.